Lawyers understand the natural law to mean that our rights come from our humanity, that they don't come from the government, that they are gifts of God, and that your right to think as you wish, to say what you think, to publish what you say, your right to worship or not to worship, your right to associate or not to associate, your right to defend yourself from anyone, including the government, if taken over by tyrants, using the most sophisticated arms available to you at the time. These are natural rights. It wasn't always so, and it wasn't always so right where we are now. I mean, when the king and the parliament wanted to raise money when we were colonists, they had ingenious ways of doing it. And one of the ways that they raised money was the Stamp Act, an abominable piece of legislation enacted by Parliament that only pertained to the colonies. They could never have done this in Great Britain to the people who elected the Parliament. They could only do it to the colonists who had no say in the makeup of the Parliament. The Stamp Act required that every piece of paper in your possession, a book, a legal document, a bank draft, a pamphlet, even a poster you were going to nail to a tree, had to have the king's image on it. You think it's a pain in the neck dealing with a post office today? You have to go to a foreign post office or a British post office and buy a stamp with the king's image. Question: how did the king know if every piece of paper in your possession had the king's image on it? Answer: Parliament enacted a piece of legislation called the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Acts permitted British soldiers to write their own search warrants. Of course, this couldn't happen in Great Britain, where the Magna Carta assured that only judges could issue search warrants based upon probable cause of crime. But in the colonies, British soldiers could authorize themselves permission to enter your house. And there'd be a knock at the door, and you would come to the door, and there's a British soldier who very politely would hand you a piece of paper that he had written, in which he had authorized himself to enter your house, ostensibly to look for the stamps. But of course, while there, they would help themselves, not only to stamps, but to food, to alcohol, to furniture, and in many cases to the house itself, which is the reason we have the Third Amendment, prohibiting quartering of troops without the consent of the owner of the house. This act was so unpopular, it's the only one that the Parliament rescinded in an effort to stop the revolution. But of course, it didn't work. We fought a revolution. We won the revolution. We wrote a constitution. In the summer of 1787, they debated in Philadelphia about the format and makeup of the government. Alexander Hamilton wanted us to have a king. Thomas Jefferson wanted us to have a very weak central government with all the power in the states. They came up with a compromise called the Constitution. But in writing the Constitution, they knew that they couldn't get it enacted unless they added a Bill of Rights. And in debating the Bill of Rights, they engaged in a very Thomas More-like debate, which goes like this. Where do our rights come from? The Madison crowd argued that our rights come from our humanity. They adopted the Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, even Jeffersonian argument that our rights are gifts from God. After all, Jefferson had written, we all know this line by rote, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The by their Creator and inalienable, meaning incapable of being separated from us, recognizes, and because it was Jefferson, and because it was the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, is the first law ever enacted by Congress. If you go to a library, or if you want to look it up on your laptop, it's still the law of the land. These aren't just Jefferson's musings. The Declaration of Independence is the law of the land, but it recognizes as the fabric of American virtue and culture that our laws come from our humanity. There was a big government crowd in Philadelphia. Yes, there was a big government crowd even in those days. And Alexander Hamilton's argument was, without the government protecting our rights, there could be no rights. And since the government pays for the protection of our rights, the government can decide what rights we have and what rights we don't. The beauty of Hamilton's system, he argued, was that the majority rules. The majority will always get its way. If the majority decides that enough on Bill O'Reilly is enough, maybe not a bad idea, only kidding, then the majority would silence O'Reilly. In the natural law system, the majority cannot silence the minority, no matter how unpopular its words may be. It is the natural law that prevails, in part because this is what Jefferson wrote, in part because these were the theories under which we broke away from a king and an island and a parliament 3,000 miles away, in part because this is a liberating theory, the concept that our rights come from our humanity. They are as natural to us as the fingers on the ends of our hands or the noses in the middle of our faces, and that the government can't take these rights away from us unless and until we are convicted before a jury of our peers of violating somebody else's rights. So, unlike the Parliament, the Congress can't declare that an individual is an outlaw or that an individual has violated the law. This can only happen under due process, which means the law existed before the person was accused of the crime, did whatever the government says he did. The person has a fair trial with a lawyer of his or her choosing before a truly neutral judge and a truly neutral jury, and whatever the outcome of that trial is can be appealed. In a nutshell, we call that due process. It's not academic nonsense, it's very serious. It keeps the Congress, it keeps any legislature from violating these basic natural rights that we have. In 1798, the President of the United States was John Adams, and the Vice President was Thomas Jefferson. Now, they were a very odd pair because they ran against each other. Remember that for the first 3 elections for president, nobody ran for vice president. Everybody ran for president. So the law of the Constitution was whoever won became president, whoever finished second became vice president. You can imagine the bizarre combinations we would have had that occurred in modern times. So you had Jefferson as the vice president, who was the small government guy, the natural rights guy. The real power belongs in the sovereign states. The federal government can only do what the Constitution authorizes it to do. And you have John Adams, who's the big government guy, who basically says, we can do whatever we can politically get away with. Well, one of the things that they wanted to get away with politically was an abomination called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were written for fear of the French. Oh, how the times have changed. Of course, what was going on in France at the time was truly fearful. It was the French Revolution. The French cut off the head of the king of France and of his wife. They got so carried away with the guillotine, they even cut off the heads of the people who had cut off the heads of the king and his wife, those who actually fomented the revolution. A character by the name of Robespierre would fall to the tiger that he had unleashed. Partly in a recognition of an effort to prevent that from happening here. And partly just because of an ethnic fear of the French. The Alien and Sedition Act said, if you're French, you want to become a citizen, you have to be here for 14 years. The Alien and Sedition Act also made it a crime to criticize the government and bring it into disrepute, specifically the President, the Supreme Court, members of Congress, and the President's cabinet. Note who was missing? The Vice President. The Federalists had no interest whatsoever in insulating Jefferson from all the criticism